Good morning. Welcome to the Open Forum session on Pack Up and Go Climate Migration. My name is Yuki Hasegawa. I'm a journalist from a Japanese newspaper, Yomiuri Shimbun, moderating today's session. It's been almost halfway through Davos meeting day, and I was surprised to find less snow this year. And what great time to talk about climate change. And today, this session is about climate migration. We often talk about, well, as a journalist, I've covered many conflicts. And I also featured a lot about refugees, for example, affected by these conflicts. But when you think about it, this displaced people of this climate change is like threefold. But it gets less attention. But it has great impact on societies and economies. I think I just read that there are about 20 to 30 million people affected by climate. But in the estimate says, as it was shown on the film, they expect like 200 million people by 2050, which would be a great issue here. So we have a wonderful panelists today to discuss what's at stake with climate and the people affected by the climate change, and talk about the current issues, and also about what we can do to mitigate the problem, and also possibly find a way forward to come up with solutions. So I would just, before I go, I would like to share this conversation with a wider audience. If you're using SNS, please use hashtag WEF23 or hashtag OpenForum so that people can join us with our discussion today. So I'll just start with introducing our panel. Just left of me, Deng Dak Malual. He's a global shaper, impact officer of Kakuma Hub. He's also a refugee, and he'll be probably giving us what's on the ground today. And we have Heidi Larson, a professor of anthropology, risk and decision science, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine from United Kingdom. Okay. And we also have Ama Francis, climate strategist, international refugee assistant project from USA. And we have Minister Beathe Tvinnereim, Minister of International Development of Norway. And last but not least, Agnes Callamard, Secretary General of Amnesty International. So I would like to start by asking each of you what you see as the issue, the core issue of this climate migration from your point of view, and give us what you do regarding the issue. Do you think, Deng, can you start with your experience?
Yeah, of course, I can start.
Yes, please do.
Okay, as you said, my name is Deng Dak Malual from Kakuma refugee camp, and I've been in the camp for the past 16 years. So regarding the topic of climate migration, in my point of view as a refugee, is that climate migration is much more and worse than the war migration that we usually know. And the fact that climate migration do not have boundaries, just like war migration, make it much worse. And therefore, currently, where I'm coming from, more than half of the refugees currently, because in Kakuma refugee camp there's around 200,000 refugees. And more than that are climate migration. What is happening is drought, flood, and other aspects of life that are caused by climate change. This make people be very at a very worse situation whereby they could not bear staying at their home. Currently in East Africa, where most of the refugees in Kakuma refugee camp are from, there is flood in South Sudan, which has been there for almost a year now. There's drought in Somalia, which is killing livelihood, that is cattle and human beings. So in Kakuma refugee camp, the majority of people are from South Sudan and Somalia. And most of them are not running away from war. They are running away from climate change. And that today, I'm here so that at least most of you have not been meeting refugees and you do not know why refugees are there, what is their fear of going back home. The fear of refugees of not going back home, one is lack of peace. There is no peace in their home country. But also that the livelihood there has been stabilized by climate change. And therefore, people has nowhere to go. Like in my home country where I'm coming from, now there is flood. If somebody tell me even today that South Sudan is having peace and that I should go there, I'll ask you, if I go there, where should I go and settle? Am I going to have somewhere to plant my crop? Am I going to have some cattle? No. Because why? There is climate change there that is destroying crop and killing cattle. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think you made a very good point that there is no border to this issue, because when you talk, we're talking about like countries in Africa today, but if we see like forest fires, floods happening everywhere around the world, it's all about, we're all exposed to this problem. So I think you made a very good point. Thank you very much. So can we move on to Heidi?
Sure.
He just talked about the people affected. From your point of view, what is the issue here? What needs to, what is the issue with dealing with the people who are affected by the...
Well, thanks. I'm an anthropologist, but I've worked mostly in health, and I was in UNICEF for 12 years in different parts of the world, but now at university, but working a lot on trying to understand kind of the social, political, cultural context of crises. And I think Deng just really really touched on one of the points that I wanted to make, which is that these are not singular crises. It's multiple, and as I mentioned, I do a lot on health. So on top of the conflict and the flooding, you get cholera. We've done a lot of work with oral cholera vaccine in some of these settings, but you lose infrastructure. Diseases are certain vectors are changing. I was based in the South Pacific for 6 years. There was not just anxiety about rising waters, but Fiji, which was the regional base, we only had we had a lot of dengue and a few other things, but everybody was waiting for malaria because malaria was in Vanuatu and the islands a bit farther, but everyone heard, with climate change, we're going to be getting malaria, and then we're going to be getting those diseases and those diseases because the vectors, for the insect vectors change. It's also an impact on schooling. I mean, kids, I think some of you are school students, and how would you feel if one day it's like, okay, guys, school's closed? I mean, you had a bit of it with COVID, but we all thought it was temporary, which it was, but longer temporary than we thought. But the impact on education, and I mean, we see what just 2 years of not being able to go to school for kids has had a big impact, and it's nothing compared to a situation where you're separated from that. So I think just this multiplicity of issues, and also we have to remember that it's not just inter-country migration. We've had a dramatic increase in urbanization because people coming from mountains that no longer, desertification, there's no longer woods there, or moving from areas that were more, I was based in Nepal for a while where the snow is melting and it's changing the whole landscape. So the urbanization impact, and could go on, but I think we've got some really important things coming down the line here.
No, thank you very much. I just want to mention, she raised a very good point. This is an open forum, so I'll be opening up the session, the latter half of the session, to the audience, so please join us in the discussion. So, Ama, can I just come to you and also maybe discuss a little bit or explain a little bit about the legal aspect of that you are expert on of this issue, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether you're joining in person or online. This is an issue that feels so important to me. I'm from an island in the Caribbean called Dominica. It's a beautiful place. Most of you have probably not heard of it, but you should look it up. It really is gorgeous. And climate change is one of our biggest threats. My family house, where I mostly grew up, was destroyed by a hurricane about 5 years ago, 2017. And this past Christmas was the first Christmas that my family got to spend in our house, which was so meaningful. And it took, I bring that up because it took 5 years to rebuild. And just want you to think of the comfort and security you get from having a stable house, and to think about what it might be like to lose that comfort and that stability. And Yuki really thoughtfully asked about the stakes of this issue. I think losing home is one of the most devastating things that can happen to us as human beings. And I think making sure that everyone has a safe place to live is one of the most important things that we can be doing. So I am so grateful that we're having this conversation, talking about climate change and migration. I'm a lawyer by training, so I think about the law a lot. And the reason that I think the law is an important piece of this puzzle is because the law structures the ability for people to move from place to place. People can move across borders, especially because there are laws in place. And right now, we just don't have the legal infrastructure that we need to deal with the scale of the challenge. We heard from Deng how important this challenge is. We heard from Yuki that the numbers. Yuki mentioned that conflict now is displacing more people than, climate change, specifically sudden onset disasters like hurricanes, flooding, drought, which is a slow onset effect, but sudden onset disasters are displacing more people than conflict, about 3 times the number of people, and has been doing so for the last decade. So while we think of war as one of our biggest global challenges, we know actually that climate change is a huge threat. And I'll just break down the links quickly so that we're all on the same page. So how it works is that climate change increases the frequency and intensity of disasters, and then those disasters then displace people. So I mentioned my family home was destroyed by a hurricane. Well, we can't necessarily prove that that hurricane was worse, that single hurricane was worse because of climate change, but we know in the grander scheme of things that climate change is making disasters worse. The reason that this is a problem from my perspective, it's a problem not just because of the human impacts, but because the law is so behind. Most of the law that we created came about in the 20th century when we were dealing with very different challenges. We are living in the 21st century now, and our law just hasn't caught up. So the question for me is, how can we make sure that as global leaders, as countries around the world, we're putting legal instruments in place so that people have the ability to move easily from place to place and access safety? I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay. Can I just make a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Not really an expert on this, but I know that there is a difference between like the refugees caused by conflict,
Right.
and these people displaced by climate change, for example. So is there a very big difference to it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Yuki. So I mentioned that many of the laws that we have in place were created in the 20th century. So international refugee law is one example. And that was coming out of a very particular context. Now, at the time that we were designing international refugee law, people weren't really thinking about climate change. So now we're dealing with a climate crisis, and we're trying to fit people into frameworks like refugee law that weren't really created to accommodate that challenge. So there is no climate category under refugee law, so to speak. So if you are a person that was displaced by drought or flooding and you show up seeking refugee protection, you usually be told, actually every court in the world has said, you are not a refugee. Even though you're facing the same impacts, displacement, you are in the same need of protection, and you are, along with your fellow people, being displaced at faster rates than conflict, which refugee law does recognize. This is one piece of the puzzle, but I actually think the puzzle is actually much bigger, because refugee law might not actually be the right framework for dealing with this challenge, and I don't think it is necessarily. Refugee law was created to respond to crisis after it's happened, but what we need is mechanisms in place to allow people to move before disaster strikes, not after. It makes for better outcomes for people, it makes them safer, and it makes for better outcomes for the communities that are receiving them. So we really need to be thinking about a legal infrastructure that can respond to crisis before it happens rather than after. And I don't think that's refugee law.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go into what we can do later in the section, but thank you for the introduction. Can we just jump to Agnes, because it touched, what Amma talked about touches on human rights aspect of this issue. I was wondering if you could give us some insights on your
Thank you.
thoughts on this.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We issued a report late last year, which is entitled "Any Tidal Wave Could Drown Us." That's what one of the community we worked with told us. They were mentioning the 200 million people that are likely to be displaced or uprooted by 2050. Those figures are based on an increase of the temperature of about 1.5, 1.7 degrees. I just want to highlight the fact that in Egypt, during COP28 on climate change this year, the prediction is for 2.5 degrees increase. So the number of uprooted people, we don't really know how large it's going to be if we don't manage to get climate change under control. And right now, we're not. Right now, we're not. Returning to people being displaced, we are engaging with communities on the front line in Bangladesh, in Senegal, in Canada, in various parts of the world. What we have found is that, as you were mentioning, people are often displaced as a result of interlinkages between repeated extreme weather events, slow environmental change that erode livelihood, and the lack of adequate assistance or support to rebuild home and restore livelihood. And in the short to long term, this forced people out of their home. And I want to insist on the fact that people are not living because they really want to. They are living because they are forced to. And we often say climate refugees are not like war refugees. People don't want to go, but they often don't have a choice. We spoke to Senegalese fishermen who are saying, we may have to move, we may have been forced to move, but we really don't want to. Because if you want to kill a fisherman, you just have to take him away from the sea. Mm-hmm. They don't want to go, but they don't have a choice. As Dan was saying, where is the cattle? Where do you find cattle? Where do you find the land? There is no livelihood left, without talking about the danger coming from crisis. People who move lose their culture. I myself spent time with an indigenous community in Quebec, the Innu people of Pessamit. And because of climate change, they are losing their traditional culture that is tied to their relationship with the forest, that is tied to their, in other places, to their relationship with animals who have disappeared. As one person told me, the loss linked to climate change is the same thing as taking away the right to your history, the right to your identity. The people that are at the front line of the climate crisis are not passive. They are not passive victims. They fight back. They organized. Every communities we engage with are proposing solutions. They want to have solution alternative to migrations, but migration is a reality, 200 million at a minimum. And we, as an international community, do not have the infrastructures for it, do not have the policies for it, do not have the laws for it, and we don't have the mindset for it. What are we doing right now around the world? We're creating fences. We're creating fences. I know we'll follow up with the solution, but I just want to return to what I said at the beginning. The international community met in Egypt this year to speak about our commitment to climate change. The UN international body responsible for looking at what's happening told us at the beginning of the meeting, with the commitment that you have made, we are far away from the 1.5 degrees increase that was part of the Paris climate change. We are into the 2.4 to 2.8 degrees increase. What does that mean? It's not just numbers here. It means millions of people losing their lives and millions of people being forced to live and uprooted. That was made clear at the beginning of the meeting. By the end of the meeting, had we gotten stronger commitment? No, just from a few countries. Just from a few countries. We are sleepwalking into a wall of death. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you for the reminder of what's happening around the world. And also, I think this leads to Anna to explain, well, she was discussing what different stakeholders should be doing, the international community. I think you were the right person to explain what's happening and what have you been doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuki. I'll try. Well, you know, when we discuss climate change here in Europe, we focus a lot on how we can reduce stop climate change, reduce it, prevent it, which is extremely important. But we also need to talk more about how to adapt to climate change, because for people like Deng, for countries like South Sudan, climate change, it's here, it's now, and it's affecting lives. At the climate negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, for example, the developing countries begged the world to help them adapt to climate change. They are not the responsible for the climate change that we are seeing, but they are paying the highest cost. So we need to help these countries adapt to the climate change that is already there. And now this is the good news. There's a lot that can be done to prevent these disasters from happening and helping people so that they don't have to migrate. And I'd like to raise one topic in particular, which is very close to my heart, and that is food production. Like Deng was saying, you know, many of the migrants are food producers. They are depending on producing their own food. That is their livelihoods. They are pastoralists, they are farmers, they are fishermen. And they are dependent on nature to function, but all of a sudden it doesn't. It's changing. So their livelihoods are destroyed. But the thing is that there are things that we can do to make sure that they can continue to produce food, to keep their livelihoods. And let me give a few examples. In South Sudan, with the flooding, we can build infrastructure to manage water. That's one example. In Somalia now, Horn of Africa is seeing the worst drought in 40 years. But there is a lot that can be done in terms of assisting food producers, farmers with methods, with agronomy and technology that can help them produce food in a changing climate. We have, for example, varieties of different foodstuffs, seeds that is more drought tolerant, or more that can stand more salinity in the soil. Whatever the challenge is, where they are, we have rice varieties that can stand more flooding. We have methods of getting access to water, to irrigation, when the rain is not coming or coming at the wrong time. So there is so much that can be done if we invest in, for example, small-scale farmers in South Sudan, in Somalia, giving them easily available technology to make sure that they can withstand these climate shocks and not having to migrate. So that's the positive side. There really is a lot that can be done, but we have to pull together and we have to get all hands on deck, assisting these people and preventing migration.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, but I think it comes to what Agnes was also saying. I mean, there's a will by certain parties like you or the Norwegian government, and also a will, maybe also different stakeholders, but there are borders when it comes to these efforts, right, Agnes? So it's not all on the same table at the moment.
I would like to acknowledge the fact that in Egypt there was one progress that was made around the concept of loss and damage. What it means is that for the first time, the Western countries, mostly the industrialized world, so that includes China and others, have recognized that they have an historical responsibility for climate change and therefore need to put money, some kind of historical reparation for the developing countries, so that the developing countries have sufficient resources to adapt to. So that was a remarkable transformation, a remarkable step, but it was, it's only one step. It's a theoretical step. So we don't know whether the money will be there. I'm hoping that governments will actually provide the funding. The funding will go to government of the Global South, not to affected communities. So there will be, it will be very important to monitor internally, domestically, how that money is being invested when the money arrives. And it is very important, but I would like to suggest or to really highlight the fact that adaptation is absolutely crucial, but that we cannot afford not to confront the fact that we need to change how we live. We need to change the way we look at growth. We need to change our interactions with fossil fuels. We need, it's not just about putting money so that some other people can do the necessary changes. We all have a very, very deep responsibilities individually, at community level, and at society level. Our dependence on fossil fuel is an enormous problem. And it is our responsibility for us all to tackle it, particularly the Western world. Otherwise, people will continue to suffer tremendously, everywhere, in our own communities, but particularly in communities that are least responsible for it.
Yes, I think collective effort is key to addressing this. But then, what do you think about these things that the so-called progress or the possibilities? How do you see it? What do you expect from these international kind of efforts to mitigate?
Well, You see, currently everybody is saying that they are involved in tackling climate change. They are standing with refugees. But now the question is, as they stand with refugees, as they stand with displaced people, are they doing what these displaced people want? Are they involving these people in what they are doing for them? So in my opinion, as a refugee, the fact is that this is 21st century, as she said. And in 21st century, you should contribute to the solution of your problems. So when it comes to climate change, refugees should not just be there in camps folding their hands. They should as well be given opportunity to contribute to global pressing issues. If, for instance, currently, if the refugees are going to be just there in the camps, let's say I moved out of my country because of climate change. I go to the next country. Climate change do not recognize these international borders. So if I'm not going to do anything in that country, it is still for us. So we are going to move out of that country when we are two, I and my host. So we go to the next country. What happens when these people reach to around 200 million that we are saying, and these people can have so much impact in the world? So before they reach 200 million people, the current refugees which are in camps should be involved in climate change action. And their work should as well be recognized when we are putting doubt on the global contribution of climate change. Nobody has ever went to Kakuma refugee camp to see the work that I'm doing, the works that other refugees are doing there. There's no trace of it in any report that this is what the refugees are doing in tackling climate change. This is what the refugees are doing in food security. So the thing is, if there is any contribution that should be done globally, get me involved. Let me do my part, both in climate change and food security, as she said, because these two work hand in hand.
Thank you very much. I think you made a very good point. And as he mentioned, I mean, we're talking about internally displaced. We often talk about internally displaced people, but people may migrate to other countries, which probably would affect, the health, medical field, also legally, possibly. We're talking about the legal support for refugees now, or the displaced people, but there might be impact on the countries or the communities receiving these migrants now. So I think one of the key things that, Agnes, I think rightly pointed out that we need to get everybody on board, including the refugees, those people that are affected. We can go on forever, I think, but I think I'd like to ask the audience to come in and join our discussion, because it's about all of us. So can we start? Okay. Is there a microphone here? This gentleman here at the front. Okay. Please state your name.
Hello.
And association. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Firas Shamsan. I'm a writer and journalist from Yemen. I'm a guest writer, city of Bern. Also now I'm considered as a political refugee in Switzerland. When we want to talk about immigrants and refugees crisis, we have to talk about two things. You know, the friend from South Sudan and Somalia, you know, like we used to have many of immigrants from Somalia come by the sea and the situation, how is it happened? But part of it, the war also, when you talk about the war and the weapons have been sending, it's make a lot of bad things, bad effects, not just killing the people, changing the climate as well. You know, the rockets, you can see it in Iraq as an example, how the people, they come with many diseases, cancer level, high problem of cancer also, when they are like also deporting, like for not just based on the war as well, also when they use it for farming. You know, there's some kind of chemicals was really bad, and then it's sold and it's go directly, and the people use it because it's grow the fruit so fast so they can sell it. So it's part of understanding the climate, working with make a solution. When we want to talk about stopping refugees crisis, when we want to stop war crisis, we have to think first, stop producing this kind of chemicals, stop producing weapons, selling weapons. So in hand, you don't, you say we need to stop the war in Yemen or some other countries, but in the other hand, you sell weapons. So this is how we can actually take a step. So I think this is really important, and we have to work more and more, because the climate change now, you see, it is there. You know, like here in Davos, the people from Davos, they are angry because there is no more snow, but in the same time, in the desert, there is a snow is coming. So it is change, it's happening, but what we can do as an action to get awareness and to do real step, as you mentioned before. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving the example. I mean, it's okay. I see so many hands. I'm so glad. So can we just move on to the gentleman here, please? Thank you.
My name is Julian. I'm a scientist. Thank you very much for your talks. I would like to ask Amma about a law question. That a war-based migration probably is easy to define by law. But the climate change-based migration is much more difficult, I guess, because as you also mentioned, your parents had this hurricane disaster, but it's not very easy to define that this is because of the climate change. So what can the law say when the disaster is because of climate change, or is it kind of normal disaster? How can we distinguish between them? Thank you.
That is such an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked that. So I will say two things. One thing is to acknowledge that the science of attribution is getting much better. So you're a scientist, I'm sure you know that it's getting easier to trace particular disasters to climate change. Hurricane Harvey that hit the US some years ago, for example, we know that because of climate change, the rainfall during that hurricane was much more intense. So science has a really important role to play, and attribution science, which allows us to link particular disasters and their effects to climate change, is really getting much better. But there is still this issue of sort of how to define when someone is moving because of climate change. Some people, when they're displaced, don't necessarily conceptualize their experience in terms of climate change. So they might not say, because of climate change, I had to move, even though that we know that climatic effects are part of their story. So that's another challenge as well. Here's what I think. I think about this all the time. And in my opinion, we don't actually need to identify when a particular person is displaced by climate change to be able to offer protection or meet that person's needs. I don't think we need that. So for example, if we came up with a climate visa that responded, we said, everyone who's from this climate vulnerable region, you will be eligible for this visa. So you individual person are not responsible for proving that this climate change related disaster displaced you. We just know that you're living in this place that's experiencing flooding, that's experiencing drought, that's making it harder for you, almost impossible, in some cases impossible for you to live in this place. You are eligible for legal relief. And then if we wanted, governments could decide what they wanted to prioritize. So we could prioritize need. We could say, you are from this climate vulnerable region, and we recognize that you are a person of the LGBTQ plus community, and so you might be particularly vulnerable. Or we might recognize that you are a person who's living with a disability, and so you need extra support. And so we could then prioritize protection based on what people's actual needs are. And that would be a way of addressing this challenge of how to identify or not being able to identify when someone is displaced by a climate particular disaster. I will just say the problem with climate migration is not that we don't have solutions. We have plenty of solutions, actually. It's that there isn't the political and cultural will to actually implement those solutions. Agnes was saying we need to change. Climate change is, for me, a thing that necessitates so much transformation of us as human societies, and creating societies where we are welcoming people is so important.
Yeah, I think that's what Agnes mentioned about the mindset that needs to change.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Next, someone from the back. A lady here? Okay.
Hello, my name is Jean Wu. I am the Director of Green Office Sustainability Programs at Franklin University, Switzerland. My question has to deal with developing legal frameworks prior to climate disasters. One thing that is common to many legal systems is this notion of causation, that you can find accountability based on different levels of responsibility. Did you act recklessly? Did you act negligently? And I wonder if we begin to see, if we can attribute climate change to certain actions, does that make it easier for us to link this idea of causation? Who are the actors responsible? And you mentioned the loss and damage funds that came out of COP27. In a way, that's an acknowledgement of responsibility. Perhaps we played a part in causing climate disasters, climate change results that are harming people. So I'm interested to hear about perhaps, as your thought regarding, I'm sorry to direct a question to you again, but this notion of causation, how do we bring it to the forefront? How do we get people to be more accountable? What level of causation would require accountability?
Okay. Alma?
Sure, happy to take that one as well. So another excellent question and really loving the engagement here. So causation has been a really big part of a lot of the climate litigation that has been happening, stepping back, a lot of the lawsuits that various groups have been bringing against various governments and actors to hold them accountable for carbon pollution, for global greenhouse gas emissions. Causation has been a really important part of that. So for example, saying you particular fossil fuel company are responsible for this percentage of emissions, and therefore you need to do X, Y, and Z to reduce carbon pollution. That's been a really big challenge and part of these climate lawsuits that have been going on the mitigation side, so reducing carbon pollution. And I mentioned attribution science before. Improving attribution science has been really important as part of this effort to create responsibility and accountability, right? But even without this science, we do know that some countries and communities have contributed very little to the climate crisis. We know that. And so for me, I think there comes a point where we can just say, we know this is a matter of global justice, and so what do we need to actually do about this? So you also asked about the legal frameworks that might be able to respond to crisis before they happen. One of my favorite legal frameworks to talk about are free movement agreements. So the European Union is one, it's the Schengen area is one, where countries can decide collectively to agree to let nationals of a set of countries move fairly freely between borders. It's not just the European Union, though. There are free movement agreements all across the world. In Eastern Africa, there's the Intergovernmental Authority on Development that just specifically set up in its free movement agreement this clause that mentions disasters in particular. There are free movement agreements in the Caribbean, where I'm from, which is actually what allowed my parents to move to another Caribbean island after a hurricane happened. And so what's cool about these agreements is that they allow people to move before a disaster happens. They're not based on you experiencing some sort of hardship. They're based on nationality. And they're based on this agreement that your country has made with another country. So there are legal frameworks that governments can agree to facilitate migration. I'll say this last thing. I had said before that refugee law I don't think is necessarily the solution. It's part of the solution, but I don't think it is the solution. We need to be increasing safe pathways. We need to be making it easier for people to move across borders in order to actually address this challenge in an equitable way. We let goods move across borders. Right now, we're all holding cell phones that are made up of so many parts and pieces that have come from all over the world. But when it comes to migration, we make it incredibly difficult for humans to get from place to place. even though moving from place to place is one of the most natural things that we do as humans. And so part of addressing this crisis is really setting up safe ways for people to move easily before disaster strikes. And free movement agreements are one way to do that, but also establishing humanitarian visas are another way to do that. Establishing student visas is another way to do that. There are so many solutions. Again, the issue is really building this culture and this will to actually implement those solutions.
Thank you. Agnes, do you want to add anything about this, for example, like humanitarian visas and as solution, one of the solutions?
I mean, I fully support the proposal that have been made. Currently, as you know, we are many societies are building walls and barriers against migrations and migrants and refugees. So the mindset and the political mindset and our own mindset as privileged societies is really an important issue that needs to be tackled. I think, yes, the legal framework can help, but if there is within countries or in Europe a majority of the population that is angry, that is anti-refugees, that is putting in power representatives that are very, in my view, anti-universal, anti-people's viewpoints, this legal framework won't go very far. It will not be implemented and so on and forth. So I think there is a responsibility for all of us to educate our own societies, our own communities. I would like to also highlight the fact that we, in the Western world, we are an increasingly old population. We are increasingly confronting labor shortage, and this will only increase. Many of you maybe were not able to go to the rest of Davos, but that was one of a big theme, you know, that the corporate actors highlighted in many meetings. You know, we don't have the workforce that is required. And the prediction is that we are not, our own societies are not going to produce that workforce in numbers. So we really need to have a very holistic understanding of how to become a new society in this, you know, in this very this world that is so you know, so much in pain. We really need to have a holistic approach that takes into account our own responsibilities for climate change, is committed to the 1.5 degrees. We need to really send that message clearly to our governments and the corporate actors, because if they can avoid changing, they will. And we need to rethink how we look at migration, how we look at refugees, how we look at our own, you know, own future as a community. Because again, we will not be able to meet our needs, whether it is workforce, whether it is retirement, whether it's pensions, whether it's demographic needs. So that's what is required. But to do that, we have a lot of education to do, and a lot of work to do with people who are so angry, so fearful, and so at war with the rest of the world.
Thank you. So, this gentleman here, the orange.
Hello, good morning all. I'm Jorge Araujo, I'm from Portugal. I'm a PhD student on climate change, and it's really a pleasure to see such a lot of panels discussing these issues. Well, I mean, we know that climate change is something that it is structural, it's a long-term issue. It's not like maybe a war or a conflict that we intend or understand that may have an end as soon as possible. So that's why sometimes it's difficult for me to understand how we can call it like climate refugees, because it's like a long last. I mean, it's going to be at least for the next centuries. And even though we can discuss if this 1.5 is actually that or 2 degrees, but we know that scientifically that these effects will long last more than 1 or 2 generations. So my challenge here for the panel is as a question, maybe to all of you, is can we try to understand and to say some long-term strategies, okay, to tackle this issue of places that we know that may not be able to account for people living there. We know that there's a massive as well extinction now going on of species, around 1,000 to 10,000 times faster than the natural causes. So all these let's say changes that will maybe ask us to actually address long-term strategies. So my question is very simple. Can you give us like some solutions, like medium to long term, that you think we could tackle this problem? Thank you.
That's for everybody.
Yes.
Okay, no challenging questions.
There's been a question over here.
There's this young man there. He has been.
Oh, okay,
trying to-
sorry.
Yes.
Maybe we could
Okay,
from the beginning. So.
after the,
Yes.
we're a bit running out of time. So
Just
do you
him.
want to ask the question first and then maybe answer the whole thing together so that we can, yeah.
Great.
Sorry.
Thanks very much.
Very sorry about that.
My name is Mats, and I think I just want to draw 3 things together that came from the panel today. The first one, the opening stats that said 200 million people would be forced to migrate. Deng, you mentioned that there is very little room for refugees to be heard, to speak up. And then I want to draw to the fact that, Agnes, you mentioned this idea of a loss of culture. And I think drawing these 3 things together, I think I cannot understand why we don't speak more about social realities, why we don't speak more about how we are able to see beyond our own social reality. Are we able to contest the socioeconomic structures that may still not really be relevant in today's world? Even this forum, the IMF, the World Bank, these are institutions that come up from a westernized context. But we need to look beyond our borders. And so how do we learn to engage in these narratives? I don't know how it feels like to be in your shoes, but I would like to know. And I think this is the first step. And I think not many people come here. Not many people are really interested, and if they are, because of economic reasons. We see that in the crisis of Ukraine. Solidarity, we call it. But it's clear it has political and economic interest. It's driven by the European center, by the West again. Where's the solidarity for the rest of the world? How do we unpack these things? So my question is, do you agree in this statement that the real core issue facing this climate crisis is our inability to understand humanity in its complexity? And if so, how do we learn to engage in these narratives of plurality?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think it relates to the previous question of what we need to do, what we could do. So maybe it's the question for everybody. So could we ask anybody to just jump in, start? Who would like to start? Would you like to start?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can go past. Well, on the question that what can be the long-term strategy of tackling climate change, I would say that currently the policies in place of climate change is that each and every government says that they are committed to do the work. And the fact is that, as she said, very few actually go and do the work. And here, there's lack of accountability. Like, majority of the governments sign up for it, but very few go and do it. So the issue is, these international organizations that are responsible for climate change, have they been actually going after the governments that have signed up and have not done their work? And to the next question, like, Mats has asked, like, how is it to be in my shoes? Well, as I said before, the reason why I'm not going back to my country is not only because of war there. It includes the climate change that we have talked about. And that leaves me no choice, but only to stay in the camp. And if, of course, we could not recognize the social boundaries which are not currently necessary in the 21st century, by the time we are reaching 2050, and there is 200 million, which is, of course, more than one country people, staying in refugee camps, staying in displaced people camps, then actually the workload towards climate change is going to be lower than the work that is actually being done toward the climate change. And even if each and every government closed their border, I am locked out there. Once this climate change is done with where I am, with me, even with military at the border, it's not going to recognize them. It is going to come for the next country next. So it is actually very right, Matt, that these structures are not necessary in the 21st century. And as she said, we need a policy whereby people are to be allowed to move out of where they are not comfortable living. Why should somebody stay in one place for more than 30 years just because they have no choice and they are not comfortable there? These are human beings just like the rest. So can those policies be put in place? Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Heidi, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I think we need on the long-term question, and it's, I mean, the question that Mats poses is not something that's short-term, but has long-term implications. But I think we need both. I mean, there's some very urgent things that need to happen now, and it starts with everybody in different ways. But we need to have a vision of where we want to be. And I think that it helps to, rather than just the vision being we need to get out of this mess, which we absolutely do, where do we want to be? What is the world we want to look like? And I think there's too many incremental efforts, kind of adjusting the furniture and not saying, this is the wrong house. You know, we need a whole new landscape. And I mean, when you think about it, it's a massive opportunity. We have a whole incredible new digital technologies that could help. We have new, emerging science of accountability?
Attribution.
Attribution. This is a big thing that I have to deal with. People want to blame things on X, Y, and Z when in fact, so the science of attribution, there's so many resources, the genetic, all the options for seeds and food, and can we take all these absolute resources and think about where we'd like to be? But it's going to take some real change, and I think it's about political will, but it's also about social will, because people, I mean, think about the 2 years of COVID, how hard it was to get people to kind of deal with what was frankly a very short-term crisis. It was hell for a lot of people, or it felt like. It is nothing compared to what we're going to need to do collectively for the long term for change. So maybe this was a little living experiment and an exercise these last couple of years on how we can be more resilient. We're doing a lot of research in our group in something called the Global Listening Project to listen to people's community experiences, how they coped, who they turned to, who they trusted around the world. And the biggest message we're getting from these communities, and we've been in every region, is the government, it wasn't that they even had a problem with the government being top down. There was this universal sentiment that they were so disconnected to our reality. They had no clue. The policies they gave didn't relate to my life. And they turned, there was more people turning to their, we saw this surge in people turning to their business more than their government, their employers, their professional networks, their churches, their mosques, their temples, and getting more local resilience. So we've got to think differently, and maybe we've got a lot to learn from these last couple of years that can help, but I do think we really need a wake-up call. I mean, I was thinking about what you said, if you want to kill a fisherman, take away their boat. One of the comments that we heard from someone was, we all did our best, but some people had a yacht and some people had a little rowboat. And she said, I was in the little rowboat. Okay.
I think we're running out of time, but it's such an important question. Can you, the rest of you, make a very short comment on the core of this question?
Sure, I'll do this quickly. But I'm really glad that you brought up COVID, because I think we saw with the pandemic that whether it's COVID or climate change, really any crisis that we experience globally affects us all, but it affects people with the least resources the worst. And so when we're talking about solutions, I think we not only need to talk about solutions, but just solutions. Climate change really exposes the fault lines of injustice. So how can we be creating just responses to the climate crisis? And I think we need to be doing at least 3 things. I think 1, we need to be increasing safe pathways. We need to make it easier for people to move to places that are safer for them. 2, I think we really need to invest in changing the narratives around migration and climate change. It is so rational for us to be trying to make for a livable Earth. We are literally setting our house on fire and not actually dealing with the crisis. It is so rational to solve the climate crisis, and it is so rational to let people move from place to place because of things like demographic decline and also just supporting people's dignity. So we really need to be changing the narrative that the climate crisis is something that we can solve, that we need to solve, and we need to do so in a just way. And the third thing that I think we need to be doing is really investing in people's ability to stay in place. We need to be investing in people's ability to choose to stay at home. And that means investing in local resilience, investing in adaptation. So it's not just about allowing people to migrate. That's important, that's really important, but it's also important to make sure that people can also stay in place.
Okay, thank you. Anna?
Thank you. Here in Davos, many people have spoken about the poly crisis. There are so many crises coming together right now. And my worry is that that poly crisis will divert attention from the climate crisis that we have been able to put at the top of the agenda in the International Forum for so long. Because we need to make sure, and you need to make sure, that your governments stick to their promises in terms of, for example, climate finance. And I'm here as a representative of a government, so that's sort of the perspective I'd like to comment on. Our promise in the climate negotiations from Norway's side was to double our climate finance and to triple finance to climate adaptation. Now, one thing is for all countries to put that money on the table. We have to make sure that we all do, but we need to get it implemented. We want to see action on the ground. So that's my final point. There are many things that we can do to prevent the awful consequences of climate change by putting that money in action on the ground. I mentioned investing in tools for the people so they don't have to migrate, for example, protecting their livelihoods so that they can withstand the climate shocks better. The other thing is to build the capacity of the countries so that they can protect their populations better. I mean, in Switzerland or in Norway, we take it for granted that we have weather forecasts and we have systems in place from the government. If there is a hurricane or a flood, someone is there to help us. South Sudan doesn't even have weather forecasts. So how can they possibly warn their people or have the infrastructure to assist when climate crisis hits? And these are things that, it can be fixed. So let's fix it.
Agnes, can you just finish
Sure.
up the...
At the minimum, we must ensure that our governments review their 2030 emission reduction targets and ensure they are fully aligned with the imperative of keeping the rise of global average temperature to 1.5 degrees. We are not there at all at the moment. We're 2.5, okay? So it's absolutely crucial that we do so. We need to phase out the production and use of all fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. At the first occasion, with the Ukraine war, the oil industry have gone back with more vigor than we would ever have expected. In fact, the head of the next COP is president of the largest oil company in the UAE. So we do not have leaders. We do not have leaders, in my opinion, and after COP, after Davos, I am even more convinced. We have leaders who are trying to find a way out of change. They are trying to find a way out of transforming our economies, our societies. We have leaders that are trying to avoid having to pay a price for climate change, while all of us are doing so. And no one more than them and these communities and that the vulnerable people. We are witnessing an increase in inequality, and that is symptomatic, in my view, of the fact that right now global leaders, economic leaders, are looking for ways out of the change that is required of all of us to tackle climate change. And we must be saying no to that. It cannot just be the small people who are going to pay the price for climate change. Just transition is key. I'm talking about justice for the most vulnerable community that are directly affected in the most awful way and least responsible, but just as well for the workers, for people in our own communities who are going to be out of work, who will be looking at a transformation of societies and who need support to adapt. That is also part of, creating societies that are resilient, that are accepting of others, that are looking to universal realities. So I will say, what do we need? We need to hold our leaders to account. 1.5 degrees, and you must change. You must ask that corporate actors look for different ways of doing business. It cannot be business as usual. It cannot be, because business as usual is what brought us here. So, dear friends, it's everyone's job, not just our job, the little people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent roundup of the discussion. I wish we had more time. I think there's a lot more we can discuss about this, but the time is up. Thank you once again for the panelists for excellent discussion, and thank you for the audience for excellent, excellent questions.